Okay, so I'm Blake Shamblin, and this is Static versus Dynamic Stretching and Improving Flexibility. Now, many of you in this room are athletes, and for those of you who are not, this information is still very relevant. Increased flexibility has been shown to mitigate injury risk across not just sports but everyday life. Slipping and falling, taking a nasty hit on the football field, and really anything in between. Some increased flexibility could be the difference between a broken hand, a torn shoulder, or just getting right back up. Now, to get that increased flexibility, however, there really is not a true academic consensus of which method is best. When it comes to stretching, there are two main branches. There's going to be your dynamic stretching, which I want you to think lunges and more active fluid movements. And there's going to be static stretching, which you're going to think in bend down, touch your toes. You're holding a position for longer. Now, in this study, I really just want to see that which of these methods, dynamic or static, is going to be the best at increasing long-term flexibility and range of motion. Now, as I said before, there is not a consensus on which routine is better. While static has been around a lot longer and is a little bit more tested, and dynamic is a lot more new, there are studies to support both methods. The lack of academic consensus does create a crossroads where many people choose not knowing any potential benefits they are losing or gaining by going a specific way. Now, as someone who's had their fair share of injuries, I would assure you I would do anything to avoid them. And I believe that many people feel the same way. That's why this research, with a little more light shown into it, can really come some great results. Now, to get into the literature review, this first article is an acute review of the effects of static and dynamic stretching on performance by David G. Bennett. Now, this study reviewed the whole impact of the stretches and came to some pretty specific conclusions. He found that for activities that require static movement, shorter, higher intensity static stretching is much more optimal to increase performance. To minimize impairment and enhance performance, there should be sub-maximal intensity aerobic activity, which really is just going to be shorter, more intense static stretching as compared to holding it for anything over a minute. Now, this research really did help me further understand the nuances of stretching, but ultimately David and I just did different paths in our research. He focused more on how you're going to perform in a game, versus I want to make sure that you don't get injured. The next article is going to be keys on dynamic stretching and its sustained effects on range of motion and passive stiffness by Mashiro Iwata. This study found that dynamic stretching does increase range of motion, which is a pretty significant finding in this field because there's really not much research out there that comes to such a concrete conclusion. I really like this article because the testing method is very similar to mine. She had around 100 participants, and she tested them in an isometric stretch twice a week. And in that stretch, she found that the static group did indeed have increased flexibility as compared to the other two groups. They tested in 15-minute intervals, where my testing was a little bit shorter. However, they did find some good results there. And finally, the effect of time and frequency on static stretching on flexibility of the hamstring muscles by William Bandy. This study, unlike the one focused on the static routine, found that flexibility, the study focused where they found that flexibility was altered, versus here they found that dynamic stretching did not greatly alter flexibility. The amount of difference in flexibility was mainly altered by the frequency of the stretching routine, but he did find some pretty interesting stats, like 30 seconds being the best option for a duration of a stretch, which I don't believe is very well known. Many people hold the stretches for even up to a minute. I like this study because they used a control group like I'm going to use, and they did find that the control group did further the results. Now let's get into my methodology. Now for my methodology, I used the experimental method. This was done in a 5-week-long routine where I had 3 groups as well as a control dynamic static stretching group. These groups did an individual regime that I had previously assigned, and I will test the flexibility once a week using my aforementioned MFS squat, which is a isometric overhead squat. After they perform this squat, I'll give them a score ranking from 1 the worst to 5 the best, and this score will be based upon benchmarks of range of motion. For example, did a participant get below 90 degrees in the squat? Did their arms get above and below, behind their head? Things of that nature. Now, I chose to do my research this way because I feel the experimental method really does allow me to better test my participants in a large group setting. I'm able to better alter my one variable, which is the regime of stretching, the dynamic or the static control. And through this method, I'm going to find some pretty cool charts and graphs that my data will provide, to make some visual tools which will make it a lot more clear if there are trends that arise. Just to note a couple caveats to my data, the inability to regulate the participants' behavior outside of the study may have influenced the findings. One of the major shortcomings, for instance, was those may have stretched outside of my testing, and I have no way to account for any of that. Although I told them to limit any stretching or anything that might improve the flexibility of this 5-week period, I have no way to truly know. There also were a couple of physical constraints to the testing, as some participants performed poorly on the last testing day because they had exercised the previous day, which would make the more challenging. All right, into my results. Here are the results that I got charted. The above graph represents the dynamic stretching participants, the leftmost graph, represents the dynamic stretching participants and their success with the PVC overhead squat following their weeks-long stretching routine. There's a pretty significant trend of improvement with an average increase of score of 1.4 points, which is the most in my study, after the 5 weeks. And very similarly on the left, the static stretching routine had an average growth rate of 1.2 points. Unfortunately, there is no strong evidence here to suggest one regime triumphs over the other one, which at first can make this research seem kind of a little bit lacking discovery. However, when you look at the control group, it's clear that there is a pretty big discovery here. The control group right there only has an average growth rate of 0.4 points, which is almost a full point below both the dynamic and the static stretching routines. Now, with that 0.4 group, it is a pretty huge discovery for this research, as I said, there was not a lot of academic conversation on whether stretching would actually really help long-term range of motion increase. That was not an academic consensus. So finding this research and seeing that there is a pretty significant difference in if a participant were to stretch versus not stretch, it's pretty huge. Now in this research, I believe there were a couple areas that could be further studied to bring greater light to this field. One of these was where a participant performed a stretching routine in relation to a workout they undergo in that time period between. For example, in the controlled stretching group, participant 4, in my static stretching group, participant 4 informed me that he had a rigorous workout within the previous 2 hours. So his body was fatigued. This did show up in the results, as his day 3 score took a significant dip. With many athletics coaches encouraging pre or post workouts following a game or practice, I think it would be pretty interesting research to find the optimal time period one does need to wait before they begin a workout such as this, when you can find the optimal period in which your muscles are fully recovered. Now, I do believe more research into the optimal time period after the muscles to recover. So, secondly, in my research, I found that, although uncommon, there were instances where participants received a lower score than their previous week. That was preceding an immediate jump in score. In 3 out of 4 instances, actually, there were 2 in static and 1 dynamic and 1 in control. Participants who underwent a dip in score did end up having the lowest overall score boost compared to week 1 to 5. They increased an average of 2 full points, which is really huge. I was kind of confused by this. How come when participants did worse 1 week, they typically ended up being my greatest improved participants? And looking into this, there's a psychological effect called the extinction burst. Now, this is typically referred to in non-athletic fields, but I do believe it could be applied. An extinction burst is where an individual is attempting to stop an unwanted behavior, and this can be really anything. This could be quitting an addictive substance, this could be stopping eating fast food, and I believe it could be stopping bad habits in a stretching routine. For example, though, to kind of give you a better idea of what it is, if your mother wants a child to stop, stealing cookies, the period before that child stops, his behavior will intensify. He'll scream more, he'll cry more, it'll cause much more of a problem, But right after that is where the child kind of slows down that behavior a little bit. Now, I believe that This is a really interesting concept, and I think that it really should be kind of looked into a bit further and see if it can be applied to athletics. Because if it can, that's huge. That would explain why a lot of people quit the gym after a month, why some people feel plateaus. It would really give some motivation that, hey, you aren't failing, you are just experiencing extinction bursts. You know, you're right on the breakthrough. And just a couple other things. When I was taking a look at the dynamic and static stretching, I also did notice that typically it was in week 3 when the dip occurred, and that is also kind of similar to the extinction burst and psychological effect. When someone views they are kind of nearing the midway point, they tend to ease up a little bit, and this is actually most commonly found in athletic fields, unlike the extinction burst, which I also believe is research that we look into a little more. So, yeah, thank you very much.